Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 4th of December. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 284 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's key headlines from Scotland and around the world. A $60 price cap on Russian seaborne oil, aimed at limiting a key source of funding for Russia's war in Ukraine, was adopted by the G7 and Australia after it was agreed by EU countries this week. Russia has said it will not accept the price cap on its oil and is analysing how to respond. President Vladimir Zelensky said the $60 price cap on seaborne Russian oil is not serious and will do little to deter Russia from waging war in Ukraine. It's only a matter of time before stronger tools will have to be used anyway. It is a pity that this time will be lost, he said in a video statement yesterday. The US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the price cap will particularly benefit low and medium-income countries that have borne the brunt of high energy and food prices. Russia's embassy in the US criticised what it called the dangerous Western move and said Moscow would continue to find buyers for its oil. The US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said on Saturday he accused Russia of deliberate cruelty in its war in Ukraine, saying Moscow was intentionally targeting civilians. Ukraine is slapping sanctions on 10 senior clerics linked to a pro-Moscow church on the grounds that they agreed to work with Russian occupation authorities or that they justified Moscow's invasion, the security services in Ukraine said yesterday. 18 Ukrainian diplomatic missions in 12 countries have received bloody packages, including animal parts, in what Ukraine has described as a campaign of terror and intimidation. Oleg Nikolenko, a spokesperson from Ukraine's foreign ministry, said the packages were simultaneously sent from one European country, which he could not disclose while the investigation was ongoing. The West should consider how to address Russia's need for security guarantees if Vladimir Putin agrees to negotiations about ending the war in Ukraine, the French President Emmanuel Macron has said. The Ukrainian army has recaptured 13 settlements in the Luhansk region, the easternmost oblast in the country. That's according to the head of the regional administration, Sergei Haidai. Russian forces are concentrating most of their strength on taking the town of Bakhmut in Donetsk, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. Latest reports are that Bakhmut is holding out against the Russian attacks. And Ukraine authorities have detained 8 people over the theft of a mural painted by Banksy from the wall of a building in the Kyiv suburbs. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined today on the Full Scottish by Bill Cruikshank. Bill is an activist in the independence movement and is a co-founder of the new Scottish Civil Rights Movement. Bill, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Andrew. Yeah, I'm keeping great, thanks. Yeah, apart from this rather bleak weather we're having.
It wouldn't be December if it wasn't a bit bleak.
Well, no,
thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us on the Full Scottish this afternoon, Bill. Thinking for a moment about the updates from Ukraine that we've just gone through, do you on the price to be paid for Russian oil shipments, which has been set by the EU and the G7 and Australia, do you think that will make any difference?
I think they can try, but I'm not sure it will make much difference because Putin, for all his faults, is a very determined, in my opinion. But so the problem here, he is a very dangerous man, as we all know. He is ruthless. Whether economic sanctions will work, I hope they do, but I am convinced, I have to say.
Thanks, Bill. And one other new development this week, of course, is that there are these parcels of animal body parts sent to 18 Ukrainian diplomatic missions in 12 countries. What do you think's going on?
Terrorism. It's absolute terrorism. Uh, it doesn't surprise me in the least. The Russians have proved that they're completely ruthless when it comes to bombing civilians and killing people. So yeah, it's par for the course, I would suggest.
Thanks, Bill. And of course, there are even more serious packages turning up too. A letter bomb in the Ukrainian embassy in Madrid left a member of staff with injuries on Wednesday, and other letter bombs have been sent to the Spanish Prime Minister, the Spanish Deputy Prime Minister, and the U.S. Embassy. So, is this another example of terrorism, or is it a stunt, or a false flag, or is someone gone seriously off the rails?
Someone has someone has gone seriously off the rails at the start of the year in Moscow, and I'm afraid that the blame obviously lies with Putin and his aggression. Um, if you look at some of these are stunts. There's no doubt about that. They're terrorist stunts, and they're designed to intimidate and cause serious issues with the people who are obviously receiving these packages. So yeah, the man has completely lost the plot, in my opinion.
Thanks, Bill. And thinking more broadly, obviously in relation to the update we've given today, but also more generally in terms of the direction of events in Ukraine and Moscow, where do you think, as the winter begins to set in really hard in Ukraine, what are your predictions for the next few months? Do you think, are we going to, for example, see an escalation of NATO's involvement? The UK has been sending search and rescue helicopters, I think, along with personnel. Or are we also going to see maybe a spread of domestic issues in Russia?
Yeah, I think that for me the issue would be that for the West. I would be hoping that people in Russia would stage some sort of coup against Putin and his regime. To be honest, I'm surprised it's not happened before. There were rumours a while back that they were plotting to oust Putin. I think that's probably the way forward for the. I would hope that the people of Russia, the very decent millions of people in Russia, will rise up and overthrow his regime.
Thanks, Bill. Another direction in terms of the events, the last update that I had there, the reports from the suburbs of Kiev that the police have arrested 8 people involved in the theft of a Banksy from the wall of a wall of a building that had been damaged by Russian shelling. What about the Banksy story? Do you think, is it helpful to Ukraine? Is it helpful to Banksy? Is it helpful to the prosecution of the war, or is it just one of these things that happens during a war?
I think the latter. I think it is one of these things that happened during the war. I'm not quite sure. Was Banksy in the Ukraine or Ukraine, I should say? I'm not sure. This is actually a new story to me. So I've not heard about it before. But I'm not sure why he would be there and why he would be painting on a wall in Kiev.
That's a very good question, Bill. I think a number of Banksy stencils have appeared in Ukraine over the last 2 or 3 months, uh, implying that he or those who work with him had been there. But yes, it does sound a little bit like, as you say, one of these curious things that happen in the midst of the madness of war, and happen as a result. But Bill, I'm grateful to you for your reflections on the update from Ukraine this week, and let's move on now to our next item this afternoon. Every day there comes another report pointing to the increase in costs for businesses and consumers, and yet Labour insists it will make Brexit work. Work for who? Whether rising food costs, a shortage of workers, or the Northern Ireland Protocol, Brexit would seem to be the elephant in the room that the UK media and political parties are ignoring. Tony Blair wrote back in October that some will continue to believe Brexit was a mistake, but should acknowledge that it will not be undone under this generation of political leadership. Those who supported Brexit should give up trying to prove to us, the rest of us, that it was the right decision, if only we believed in it enough. It is what it is. There are ways to fix the relationship. It is crucial it is fixed. It can be done without overturning the Brexit decision, so do it and move on, he wrote. So, Bill, ever the pragmatic politician there for Tony Blair, I'd like to look at what he was saying, what he was writing in October with you in three parts. The first thing was he says Brexit will not be undone under this generation of political leadership. Now, inevitably, that language leapt off the page at me, especially from a Scottish perspective. I wonder, how long do you think Tony Blair thinks a generation is? And whatever the length of a generation is in his mind, what does his assertion that Brexit will not be undone for a generation? What does that mean to Scotland? Do you think?
Well, the first thing I would say about Tony Blair is he shouldn't be where he is today. He should be in prison for his illegal war in Iraq. Secondly, Tony Blair speaks for the English establishment, or the British establishment, shall we say. He is barking up the wrong tree if he thinks that Scotland is going to sit back and just listen to what he and his colleagues, Gordon Brown, etc., say about British politics, because as far as I'm concerned, Scotland's had enough. We voted to stay in, 62%. That figure now is over 70%. The last poll I saw in Brexit was 72%. So for him to say that there'll be no change while people in Scotland are scrimping and saving, there are people in Scotland who are trying to heat their homes or feed their families, people who can't find work. We have got an NHS under severe pressure because we have no workers coming from East Europe to work in the NHS. I read yesterday that 4,000 doctors had refused to come and work in the NHS in Britain. So these people who give you that sort of, or give us that sort of rhetoric are no more than gangsters. They are gangsters because they are making money. The Tories have made millions out of Brexit, and it's ordinary people, ordinary working class people who are suffering. And it gets me very agitated indeed to think that these people can dictate to Scotland. It's just not on. Those days are long gone.
Thanks, Bill. I'm pretty confident you're not the only person who gets agitated at being lectured about what people of Scotland can and cannot do by people who are not in Scotland. The second thing I was going to talk to you about from what Tony Blair was saying was he says that those who supported Brexit should give up trying to prove to the rest of us that it was the right decision if only we had believed in it enough. Now, it struck me that in 2016, it was largely straightforward fundamentalist belief that secured Brexit in 2016. So why would the political approach of the Brexiteers change now? And is maybe that, if it is changing, is that maybe because the sunlit uplands of Brexit are beginning to crumble in the cold, hard light of day? We're starting to see some Brexiteers saying, this is not the Brexit I voted for.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me about Brexit is that why did it happen in the first place? And if you go back to pre 2016, Cameron was basically trying to save his party because UKIP were making inroads into the Tory vote. They knew that there were seats in England which were very susceptible to this sort of racist rhetoric that we get, and they were going to stop immigration from the EU and all the rest of the nonsense that we got at that time. So it was a political ploy by Cameron to introduce Brexit. It wasn't, I mean, he knew and Johnson knew that it was political or economic suicide to withdraw from one of the biggest markets in the world. For Scotland, we're suffering because of this internal battle, which is still going on today, between the right and the left in the Tory party. And it strikes me that ordinary people in Scotland, are suffering for these, as I call them, gangsters, because they're corrupt gangsters. They made money out of Brexit. There's no doubt about that. Rees-Mogg being one of them. So I am, again, very agitated about that. But the problem is we've been actually played here, and the Brexit cannot work. Let's be honest, it cannot work. Economically speaking, it's a disaster, and that the chickens are coming home to roost there. So the only way I can see we can get out of this mess is independence and renegotiate with the EU, who would be very receptive to us going back into the EU.
That's a very good point, Bill. I'm not. I'm going to. I wouldn't wish to put you into the mind of Tory politicians, because I'm not sure
Mhm.
what that kind of place is likely to be. However, the point you make there is that there's been internecine warfare within the Conservative Party for at least a decade now, probably 2 decades if we go back to John Major and his troubles with the EU, with anti-EU politicians in the Tory Party. At what
Mm.
point do you think that that warfare within the Tory Party is going to finish, and what do you think might lead to it finishing? Either a recognition that Brexit was a disaster, or the union falling apart completely as a result of Brexit, or maybe something else.
I personally, I think the Tory party is in probably the greatest danger of splitting into that it's been in my lifetime. The right and the left in the Tory party are obviously at each other's throats. I suggest that Sunak is holding on by a thread. The ERG group, as we know, who, in my opinion, are quasi fascists, if not full fascists, they are very, very angry with Sunak's approach. And one of the worries that I have, and again, I go back to why Scotland's suffering. Only a few months back, only a couple of months back, we had Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng come out with the most ridiculous economic policy in the Kwarteng statement, which almost blew the UK economy right out of the water. Now, young people, especially young people who are trying the property ladder, are suffering badly because you cannot get a mortgage. The mortgage market is a shambles at the moment, and it's down to those two idiots. That's the only way I can describe them. Absolute idiots, amateur politicians who couldn't govern a country, they couldn't run a raffle, never mind govern a country. So we've got a problem here, and we've got to address that problem. This is why I'm saying, I've said a few times that the SNP is going to have to get much more radical, because people in Scotland are suffering real hardship because of idiots in Westminster.
Thanks, Bill. And I said that we would round off the reflection on what Mr. Blair, Tony Blair, has been writing. So we'll do that briefly and then move on to talk about some other aspects of Brexit. But the last thing he said was, "It is what it is. There are ways to fix the relationship. It's crucial. It is fixed. It can be done. So do it and move on." Now, I think you and I would agree that, of course, it's crucial, but can it be fixed by this current generation of political leaders at Westminster? I've been struck by the lack of policy around fixing Brexit. It's all still just words to me from Keir Starmer, and for the Tories, it's just ricocheting from one crisis to the next. So I wonder, how can a dyed-in-the-wool Brexiteer like Rishi Sunak possibly hope to deal with political operators like the DUP? And after everything that's happened, how could he possibly hope to persuade Brussels to do business at all?
Well, the problem with Tony Blair is that she's pulling Starmer's strings. Well, Brown, judging about yesterday about how Starmer was going to abolish the Lords, which they said they were going to do. Labour said they were going to do in 2010, in 1910, sorry. Um, but then Brown comes in and says, "Oh no, we're only talking about reforming the Lords." So who is actually in charge of the Labour Party at the moment? And while I'm on Starmer, I can not understand for the life of me any leader of a Labour Party wishing to make Brexit work and come out with statements like there'll be no return to freedom of movement for Labour. It's beyond my comprehension. So when we're talking about Starmer, Brown, Blair, Sunak, we're talking about the same clique, same political ideology. They're all together. There is little difference between the Tory party and the Labour Party, in my opinion.
That's perhaps an understandable point of view, Bill. But let's move on from looking at the what those people are saying, because what the politicians are saying, and for a moment, I was going to reflect on what the press in London are or are not saying. I think some people feel that there's now a widespread Brexit omerta. There's a Brexomerta going on, and there's an apparent blanket ban on the use of the Brexit word uh, uh, in the London-based press. And I was wondering, is that a reflection of the interdependency between the London-based press and the government of the day, or is there something else going on that's preventing discussion of Brexit in the media? I'm reminded that the owners of all of the major newspapers were pretty strong Brexit enthusiasts. So I'm wondering, are they regretting what they promoted, or are they just counting their cash, or are they just busy moving away from the scene of the crime?
I would say they're busy moving away from the scene of the crime, because this is one of the great worries that I have about the UK in general, and especially in the Scottish context. The media and the press in this country are controlled. There's no doubt in my mind that they are controlled by a gang of corrupt, extremely right wing, very wealthy men and women who have deliberately buried the word Brexit from broadcasts in the newspapers. If you listen to the television news, BBC, ITV, or whatever it happens to be, read the papers, every single one of them has buried Brexit. The crisis in the NHS is largely due, it's down to two things: COVID, obviously, and a lack of staff. And the lack of staff comes from a direct result of people leaving the UK because they were made to feel unwelcome. Let's be honest, that's what the Tory press and the Labour Party in general now, their immigration policy is virtually the same as the Tories. They have made people from Poland and Eastern Europe unwelcome. They feel unwelcome in this country, or the UK. And that, to my mind, is criminal. And people, again, all over the UK are suffering.
Thanks, Bill. We're going to look at the media in a little bit more detail for a few minutes now, because the BBC chair Richard Sharp, who's a former banker friend of Rishi Sunak and a former advisor to Boris Johnson, has criticised Emily Maitlis over her Dominic Cumming introduction on Newsnight several months ago. Mr. Sharp also has said that there is a liberal bias at the BBC, and that's in the same week that the ex-GB News editorial director John McAndrew has become the BBC's new director of news. So, in a report in the Times on the issue of impartiality in its news coverage compared with its rivals, Richard Sharp told the Times, "We can expose the brutal repression of the Uyghurs in China without having to worry that our business in China will suffer. At a time when some commercial news networks avoid some issues, air conspiracy theories, and fake news, or misrepresent history, we must continue to lead the world in trusted news." Now, Bill, that struck me as an interesting perspective. I don't think many would criticise the BBC's international news coverage or its reputation when measured against other international news organisations. But I would argue that's in very sharp contrast to the BBC's domestic coverage in the UK. And I was wondering, is that domestic output damaged because, to use Sharp's own words, the BBC worries that its business in the UK will suffer? And by business, I mean the interests of the British state and the Westminster government of the day.
Yeah, well, Paul Kavanagh, wee ginger Doug, summed it up for me a while back, a good while back, when he said, the clue is in the title, British Broadcasting Corporation. I've actually stopped watching the BBC. I don't listen to the radio, BBC Scotland. I used to be an avid listener to all of BBC programmes. I stopped listening prior to the 2014 referendum. I now no longer watch BBC Scotland, and I listen to the national news at 10 o'clock each evening, but that's about it. For me personally, I don't trust a word, whether it be domestic news or international news, that the BBC puts out. Basically, they are a propaganda uh, organ for the British state. I don't think there's any question about that. And you just have to look at the bias, British bias in Scotland, when every night on the news, and this is one of the reasons I actually stopped, and I know I'm not alone here, stop watching, is because it's a constant attack on people like Humza Yousaf and the Scottish NHS. And having friends and relations who work in the NHS in Scotland, I can assure you they are undermined, they are depressed, and it's down to the coverage and the attacks by the Labour Party, especially the Labour Party in Scotland, on the NHS through the medium of the BBC. So basically, we are under the cosh of a broadcaster who basically works for the British state. I don't think there's any doubt about that anymore.
Thanks, Bill. In thinking about the story today, it struck me that the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, previously was Deputy Chairman of the Hammersmith and Fulham Conservative Party in the 1990s. Richard Sharp, who we've just been talking about, is a Tory donor and an advisor to present and past Conservative Prime Ministers. Robbie Gibb now sits on the BBC board, apparently as, and I quote, one of the non-exec directors of the board responsible for upholding and protecting the independence of the BBC by acting in the public interest and exercising independent judgment. And of course, Robbie Gibb was previously a political advisor to Francis Maud. He played a leading role in Michael Portillo's unsuccessful campaign to lead the Tories, and he became Director of Communications for Theresa May. And then now, in addition, we've got John McAndrew, who was Editorial Director and Director of News at GB News on its launch last year, and he's now the Director of News to be the Director of News at the BBC. So what I was going to ask you, thinking about those characters, is the politicisation of the management of the BBC just an inevitability of 12 years of one government or another being in power, or is there something else going on here?
It's a very good question, Andrew. And I'm going to make a suggestion, and it's a personal opinion that I have. We were talking earlier about the split in the Tory party. Now, there is a cabal, in my opinion, there is a cabal within the Tory party, and I'm going to name the cabal ERG. They are the most dangerous group of people that the UK has ever had at the heart of government in my lifetime. They worry me because, as I said earlier, my opinion, they are very, very right-wing, if not fascist. Now, when you've got a group like that who are basically in charge of the Tory party at the moment, even though Sunak is the Prime Minister, he's there on the, well, let's put it this way, he's there on their, because they're letting him be there at the moment. They tried it with Johnson, they tried it with Truss, so they thought we'll roll it back a wee bit and go a bit softer with Sunak. But the point I'm going to get to is basically these people run the BBC for their own ends. I think it was a deliberate. They've been in power 12 years. They have managed to get this cabal into a very, very powerful position within their party and government, and they are now using the BBC as their political broadcasting weapon. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The BBC are not impartial. They're far from it. They are very right-wing and will continue to be so. And that, from a Scottish perspective, terrifies me because we're going deeper and deeper into this, what I would call a channel, if you like, or down the fascist rabbit hole. It's very worrying indeed.
Thanks, Bill. I think that's probably enough raking through BBC management for the moment. And as you say, you don't consume much of the BBC's domestic output yourself nowadays. So one thing that the BBC have also been saying this week in a report, they say a particular issue we raise is that we have found audiences in lower socioeconomic groups and disabled audiences continue to be less satisfied with the BBC. This has been the case for a number of years. Those classified as falling within lower socioeconomic groups, in particular those referred to as D and E groups, represent a quarter of the UK population. But these audiences consume less BBC content and have consistently rated the BBC lower than other audience groups. As a result, the BBC says it's going to commission more TV content aimed at C2, D and E audiences, particularly lighter drama, crime drama and comedy drama, as well as factual entertainment competition formats and sports documentaries. So before we look at that long statement in a little more detail, Bill, the first thing that struck me is why would this report bracket together viewers who are in lower socioeconomic groups and viewers who are disabled?
Well, Andrew, I was privileged enough to teach in Scottish schools for 35 years. For 25 years of those 25 years of that time, I was very privileged to teach youngsters with additional um, supporting needs. ASN children, special needs, I should say. So when you label people who are maybe not as well as yourself economically, or possibly have other issues in their life which uh, make life difficult, shall we say, very difficult in many cases, it worries me intensely that these people should be labelled and put into groups. What are we talking about here? This is what the Nazis did. They put people into groups, and the next thing was they were actually killing people with additional support needs. And that is, just labelling this people on lists, if you like, and saying they're this or they're that, is completely alien to the way I think. And I think most decent people would agree with it. It's just another aspect of what's going on in this country. I just think that's a despicable way of approaching broadcasting. To suggest that these people, it's a sort of dumbing down even of for these people to or programming for these people, it really, really terrifies me. And I would fight tooth and nail to make sure that never happens.
Thanks, Bill. And I was going to be a wee bit contentious, a wee bit contrary, just to see what you think. And I was thinking of the perspective that others might take on what you and I have just been discussing. Might it also be the case that all of what you and I have just been discussing is simply left wing hand wringing? Shouldn't it be the case that the BBC should be run by bankers and Tory political operators because they know best? And anyway, TikTok's going to replace the BBC within the next 10 years.
Yeah, well, to suggest that this is left wing hand wringing in my part and other people's parts is completely untrue. What we're witnessing here is basically right across in general, a right wing, very right wing agenda has been set, and the discussion we've had this morning alone in the last half hour suggests that's what's happening. Let's be honest, that we are in a very serious, and I'm talking especially about Scotland, because England voted for these people time after time for the last 12 years. They are in the situation because of who they voted for. And they knew fine well people like Johnson was a complete crook. But it was Boris, he was funny. Let's have him in here. Now they are going to reap the rewards of having the most right-wing government in my lifetime. In fact, I would suggest in the history of the UK state. And it's an absolutely terrifying prospect. When you start labelling people in the broadcasting, your British Broadcasting Corporation are going to label people to dumb down programmes for them. No, that's not the society I want to live in. I want everybody to be treated equally and fairly. And if that's left wing hand wringing, so be it. I'm a left wing hand wringer. Excuse me.
Thanks, Bill. I wasn't meaning to put your blood pressure up there. I was just reflecting on what some other people might have said, but you've made the point. You've responded to the point. Absolutely. And the one last thing I was going to ask you, I was just, without making light of it too much, but I was just wondering, in light of what you and I have just been discussing in terms of the politicisation of the management of the BBC, in terms of the way in which the BBC is apparently now slicing and dicing its audience, and in the words of many commentators on YouTube, dumbing down content because that's what the BBC thinks it should do. Do you think are the ashes of the first Director General, John Charles Walsham Reith, Lord Reith, are his ashes spinning in his grave, which are in the ruined chapel at Rothiemurchus?
I think they must be, because I was a bit of an amateur student of the Second World War. And in those days, the BBC, the French resistance, and people all over Europe listened intently to the content of BBC broadcasts on fear of death, I might add. And it seems to me that the BBC in those days was indeed a impartial political broadcaster with integrity. Nowadays, as I said earlier, it's just a Tory mouthpiece. And when I say Tory, I mean Labour also, because you can't shove a bus ticket between their policies. So I'm afraid that the BBC, for me anyway, is finished as a broadcaster.
Thanks, Bill. We've discussed that at quite some length, and I think we've given it a good going over. So let's now move on to our next item this afternoon, because who would have thought that Gordon Brown's proposed reforms of the House of Lords would be watered down before they are even properly launched? Gordon Brown and the Commission for the UK's Future has been trailed and tested through the press for several months. However, Keir Starmer has been warned by Labour peers that he risks getting bogged down in a constitutional quagmire that will prevent him from completing other urgent domestic reforms if he pushes ahead with plans to scrap the House of Lords in the first term of a Labour government. So, Bill, as you alluded to earlier on, is this just an old sang from Labour? They've been promising to reform the House of Lords for more than 100 years. It didn't happen then, and it won't happen under Starmer because it's too difficult.
It's a good question, Andrew. One of the worries that I have just now with the Labour Party in general. So we have Keir Starmer is the supposed leader of Labour, but we have two ex-prime ministers, Labour prime ministers, Blair and Brown, who seem to me to be pulling the strings or Starmer strings. Who is actually in charge of the Labour Party at the moment? Is it Starmer or is it Blair or is it Brown? And if we go back not so long ago in history, Blair and Brown were two of the greatest criminals that the Labour Party has ever used. Blair went to war, an illegal war in Iraq. Brown financed that war because he was Chancellor at the time. So, in my opinion, both are have a very, shall we say, murky past, to say the least. And I think it's about time that the Labour Party had a look at itself and said, where is it actually going? Is it going to go along with this neoliberal right-wing agenda that Blair and Brown seem to have set for it? Because I don't believe that Starmer's a socialist for a start. So Labour is no longer the party of the working class, that's for sure. So they should really come out and say exactly what they're playing at here. Because this reform, 1 minute Starmer was saying he was going to abolish only last week. Then Brown wades in and says, no, we're not abolishing, we're only going to reform. So exactly, what is the purpose of Labour at the moment? Are they fighting for the working class? No, that's the bottom line. And so they're not a Labour Party in the real sense of the word Labour.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and an interesting point. That's an interesting point that you're making. We were talking earlier about how the Tory party is consumed with fighting amongst itself. We're now discussing how perhaps arguably the Labour Party is consumed with fighting amongst itself. And it's pretty clear that other political parties, perhaps closer to home, are operating to some extent in the same way. And so do you think, is that perhaps one of the symptoms or one of the causes of the current repeated political crises, that our current political classes are apparently more focused on fighting amongst themselves for power rather than actually putting forward policy platforms and trying to make things better for voters?
I don't think there's any doubt about that, Andrew. You're right. Both the main political parties in the UK are fighting like rats in a sack. But one of the things, especially, I don't have a problem with the Tories. I understand where they're coming from. They're for their own people, their own class, the upper, the British establishment, if you like. They've always been that way. What destroys, or not destroys, but what upsets me about the Labour Party is they've forgotten. They've forgotten why they were founded. You were talking about Lord Reith earlier and it's burling in his grave. I wonder what Keir Hardie's thinking just now. I wonder if if he's around. What would he be? He'd be burling in his grave. I'm thinking of people, big figures in the Labour Party like Jimmy Maxton, real socialists, Willie Gallagher, real socialists who fought long and hard for the working people of this country. To see a Labour movement, not only the party, but the movement. There's one socialist I can think of off the top of my head at the moment in the Labour movement, and that's Mick Lynch. He's the only man who really, you could say, is a proper socialist and out to help ordinary people, ordinary working class people. The Labour Party, to me, are a goner. They're no longer Labour. They are quasi right-wing mishmash of people who have been led supposedly led by Starmer, but I've got a bad feeling that Blair and Brown are still pulling the strings in the Labour Party. So no time for Labour, no time for the Tories.
That's a good point, Bill, and it'll not surprise you to hear that I've speculated several times on Broadcasting Scotland as to just how fast Keir Starmer is rotating in his grave in Glasgow. But coming back to
Mhm.
look a little bit for a moment at what we are told through the press that Gordon Brown's report is going to do or say, it's reported that Brown's report will recommend moving to an elected second chamber, which is apparently to help restore faith in the political system. It will also include plans for radical devolution of powers to the regions in, quote, the biggest transfer of power out of Westminster ever. And there will also be plans to restore faith in politics through a new system to govern ethics. Now, that's already quite a hefty shopping list to my mind, and we know that incoming governments often are only at their most effective in terms of making change in the first 100 days. So that's quite a long, quite a heavyweight list to try and deliver in 100 days. So, which, if any of those three things, do you think has any chance of ever seeing the light of day?
Well, we know that the reform or the abolition of the House of Lords is not going to happen. The British establishment wouldn't let it happen. There's too much to be lost there in terms of money to gain. So that's definitely not going to happen. I doubt if any of the three will actually take place because we had this fascinates me. We're going to transfer power, the biggest transfer out of Westminster in living memory, to Scotland. Yeah. So we have this situation where we were promised a vow prior to the 2014 referendum. We have had virtually nothing that was said in that vow transferred to Edinburgh. And if anything, what's happened is that the powers of the Scottish Parliament have been curtailed. So I simply don't believe anything that Labour says anymore because they lied in 2014. And I actually, along with many thousands of other Yes activists, canvassed the doors in my local area. And to be honest with you, I was horrified some of the comments made by older people, pensioners, who were terrified that they were going to lose their pension because Mr. Brown said it on the television, we would lose our pension if there was a yes vote. Now, people told me they were absolutely petrified that this was going to happen, and he caused so much hurt and damage to people, and he's damaged Scottish democracy with lies like that. So, no, I have no sympathy for the Labour Party, and especially that cabal, because they lied in 2014 and they're lying in 2022.
Thanks, Bill. And one thing I think when I was speaking a moment ago, I got my Keir's mixed up. I should have been saying that Keir Hardie was burling in his grave in Glasgow. I think I maybe said Stammer by mistake. My apologies. But thinking about the Labour Party and operations in Glasgow, speaking in Shawlands with Anas Sarwar by his side, Keir Starmer said an incoming Labour government would have clearly have priorities, which I think match where most people are in Scotland, which is dealing with the cost of living crisis, dealing with our economy, getting it growing, and making sure that we've got the right jobs in the right places and that Scotland can thrive. Now, maybe it's just me, Bill, but isn't that pretty much exactly what any London based politician would say, no matter which party?
Absolutely. It's the same script all the time. And one of the things that, amuses me about this whole idea that we're going to grow the economy. How are we going to grow the economy when we've got Brexit hanging round our necks like an albatross? That's all it is. It's an economic albatross round our necks. And I just don't see how the UK can grow its economy and create work and create employment when you've got the biggest market sitting in your doorstep and you're having all these issues with trying to get goods to it. We only need to look at the West Coast fishing and shellfish industry at the moment in Scotland. Completely devastated, absolutely wiped out almost because they couldn't get their produce to the markets in Europe in time. The, this this little Englander insular attitude that's coming out of Westminster today and has been for a long time is ruining the UK, and that will eventually break up the UK. That's my prediction.
Thanks, Bill. And when Stammer also said while he was in Shawlands, he said, we're doing well in Scotland. we continue to build our case, but it's a very positive case for change. He said, I'm not arguing for the status quo in Scotland, change in Scotland within the United Kingdom. So we've been reflecting on the current condition of the Labour Party, of the British Labour Party, and their emanations in Scotland. So when he was saying that the Labour Party is doing well in Scotland and they're continuing to build their case, is this delusion, or is he simply saying what he thinks the folks back home in London want to hear, or is something else going on?
Well, I think if you look at, I had a chapter yesterday, I think it was a journal claiming that there was a Labour run. There seems to be some sort of move towards Labour again, and I think that's a reaction to the Tories being in such a state that people are saying, well, let's give Labour a chance here. But if you look at the actual polling, there was a poll out yesterday, I think it was, it was an all UK poll, and the SNP were at 5%. Now, 5% for the SNP in an all UK poll is a remarkable result. It proves that the SNP vote is holding up well. Labour's won a couple of by-elections, but they weren't actually wins. They were more holes, if you like. They were originally Labour seats anyway. So I don't believe that the Labour Party is making the inroads that they believe they are making. And the other thing to remember is, no matter what happens on that side of the fence, if you like, the Tories are facing a wipeout in Scotland. My own MP, Andrew Bowie, is... I know for a fact win, and he knows it. And I think he was down in the South West England the other day, looking for a safe seat down there because he knows he's finished here. So the Tories are going to get wiped out. Whether Labour makes much of a revival or not, I doubt very much they will. They might win one or two seats in the Central Belt, but that'll be a bit.
Thanks, Bill. And that's a good point that you make. Of course, this week on Friday, the British Labour Party was celebrating a by-election victory after retaining the seat in Chester with an 11-point swing that pollsters say would give the party a comfortable majority in Westminster if repeated at a UK general election. They received 17,309 votes, which is almost a 62% share of the vote, and they achieved their highest ever majority in the seat. Conversely, the Conservatives received 6,335 votes, their worst result in the constituency since 1832, and the Liberal Democrats came a distant third with 2,368 votes. Now, at the same time, the constituency's status as a safe seat for Labour is a relatively recent development. I remember Giles Brandreth used to be the Tory MP for Chester, and in 2010 the Conservatives took the seat from Labour with a 2,583 majority. So, thinking for a moment about politics in the northwest of England, does this result in Chester after the 2019 catastrophe across the north of England for Labour? Does it suggest that Labour is once more beginning to do well, at least in the northwest of England? Or, as you suggest, is it simply a reaction to the catastrophic performance of the Tory party?
Certainly think that it's a reaction to the catastrophic performance of the Tories. But, as I said earlier, Starmer is copying, to a large extent, Tory policies. And then one of the Tory policies he's very, very strong on is the anti-immigration side of things. And this is obviously an appeal to the Red Wall. He's actually trying to steal the Tory clothes here. And they will pick up seats in the Red Wall with that sort of rhetoric. To me, it's a false rhetoric. It's damaging the country. We need Labour in the country. We've got, as I said earlier, the NHS is struggling simply because we can't get people to work in it from Europe. So they're copying, they're playing politics with people's lives here. And in my opinion, it's a nasty side to politics that you rely on immigration or trying to stop immigration to further your own political ends, because nobody's a winner there. Absolutely no one. I've no time for Labour anyway, but to copy Tory policies on things like immigration, it's very distasteful to say the least.
That's a very good point that you make, Bill. We were talking earlier about labelling groups of voters or others in our community, in our society, and apparently then starting to blame them for what's going on and what the likely outcome from that kind of political approach is going to be. But just to finish off this little point with regard to Labour, one of the things that strikes me is, of course, that the way in which the performance of the NHS in England and the performance of our Scottish NHS are treated differently by the Labour Party north and south of the border, and differently again in Wales. And reflecting, as you say, about the impact which Brexit has had on the size and scale of the NHS workforce, both north and south of the border. Do you think we can compare the reaction of voters in the north of England and voters in Scotland in terms of their reaction to the way in which the Labour Party approaches the performance of the NHS north and south of the border, as you said before, after COVID and after Brexit, and in the face of the challenges, in the face of a cost of living crisis as well?
One of the big problems we have with the NHS reporting of how it's working, um, we have an issue with the reporting of how the NHS is working. In Scotland, we are constantly that our NHS is failing, collapsing, falling to bits. But what they don't tell you, and the broadcasters don't tell you, and the papers don't tell you, is that the NHS in Scotland is the best of the four parts of the UK. It's operating at a better level than in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And that's never reported. All we get is Anas Sarwar and Jackie Baillie constantly criticising aspects of the NHS. And one of the other things I would point out is that when we left, or before the 2016 EU referendum, we were promised on the side of a bus that the NHS would be financed to the tune of 350 million a week, if I remember rightly. 350 million a week for the NHS because we're going to leave the EU. Where is that 350 million? That's what I'd like to ask every politician in this country. An absolute lie of the first order.
Thanks, Bill. I think that's more than enough time thinking about the British Labour Party. So let's come back to Scotland for our final item this afternoon. As has been reported over the last few days, following Ian Blackford stepping down as the Westminster group leader of the SNP, Alison Thewlis MP last night announced that she's putting herself forward to be the new group leader. And of course, there's been widespread reporting that the Aberdeen South MP, Stephen Flynn, is also considering throwing his hat into the ring. Now, behind the scenes, some party sources have been briefing that this change is because of generational issues, perhaps relating to gender issues and perhaps the handling of recent sexual harassment allegations. But it may also be the case that they want fresh legs in the battle to turn the next general election into Indy Ref 2. So, first of all, Bill, do you think is now the time for fresh leadership of the SNP group at Westminster?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think hats off to Ian Blackford. He's been a great performer in the Commons. And I would just add to that because let's be honest, and I use performer because that's all you are in the Commons. The whole place is a circus. So you're performing in front of an audience. But to give the man credit, he has stood firm. He has been a good debater and basically been effectively the opposition in recent years against the Tories. Excuse me. But no, I think the time has come. Yeah, he is, I believe, 61. He's done a good job as far as it goes in the Commons. But I've said for a while now that, in my opinion, I've been a member of the SNP since many, many decades, way back, I think it was 68 I joined. So I've said for a while that the SNP needs much more of a radical edge. And I believe that a man like Stephen Flynn, who is a good orator, who is a very, very capable politician, he's 34 years of age, so he has the energy to take the fight forward. I believe that possibly, as I said, we need a much more radical edge to the SNP. And I'm talking about things and doing things in the Commons. If you're going to do something, do it properly and make a noise about it and let the world know. Let the world know that Scotland at the moment is a political prisoner because we're not being allowed to vote in our own future. And I believe someone like Stephen Flynn will take that message to the international community and they will support Scotland in our present struggle.
Thanks, Bill. That's a great way of summing up the current campaign, and I'm sure that we will be returning to discussing the leadership of the SNP Westminster Group as we see the results of the election, which I think takes place at their AGM on Wednesday this coming week. However, I'm afraid to say that's all the time that we have for you this afternoon on Broadcasting Scotland. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new supporters, which will enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Click on the little bell you can see just beneath the screen. Now, we will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching, and of course, I would like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, Bill Cruikshank. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Andrew.
I'm reminded that on this day in 1745, Charles Edward Stuart and the Jacobite army reached Derby. In London, only 150 miles south, there is total panic, and it's reported that George II is preparing to flee the country. I wonder what will happen on this day in Scotland's future. Please have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.